Our session now is about whether governments care more about politics than policy. I was speaking with some of the panelists beforehand, and they said, well, we can be done in 30 seconds. It's pretty obvious what the answer to that is. I think we will have a longer debate, though. We're going to go until 2:15. We have a truly fantastic panel. Really, I don't think we could have put together a better one. I'm just going to make a few quick opening remarks. Then each of the panelists has very self-sacrificingly agreed to cut their brilliant prepared speeches down to 5 minutes so that we have time for some real discussion within the panel. And then I hope at the end we'll have time for 30 or even 40 minutes of collective discussion, because I see that this is a crowd that has a lot to say, which is very nice. So by way of opening, I just can't resist saying I was both thrilled and dismayed to find that my session was going to follow Peter Mansbridge's session, because any Canadian journalist considers him to be an iconic figure. And just to give you a sense, especially for the non-Canadians here, of just how iconic Peter Mansbridge is, shortly after Barack Obama was elected, so still sort of the height of Obama mania, there was a trip to Canada that he was making, so they said Peter Mansbridge went to the White House to do an interview with the president. And there was a young Canadian aide to Barack Obama who was so thrilled that as the president was leaving, he was leaving for an important speech to announce the stimulus. Remember that? You know, huge, probably, you know, the most consequential policy of the president's administration so far. And he says to the president, you know, he says to President Barack Obama, this was the most exciting day of my life because I've been in the same room with Peter Mansbridge. This is actually a true story. And Obama says, would you like to meet him? Okay? He says to his aide, would you like to meet the guy who just interviewed me? And the aide says, oh my God, do you think I could? And so Obama actually stopped his group going towards their plane, walked back, stopped Peter Mansbridge, and introduced his aide to Peter Mansbridge. And he then told his mom about it. And so Peter actually knows this story because he gets this email from this lady in Victoria who says, this is the proudest day of my life. My son, who works for the President of the United States, met you. So there you go. We were all in the presence of true greatness. Okay, on to our panel. My just two quick thoughts before we kick off were first, I couldn't help but be intrigued by one of the final sentences of our marching orders for this panel, which was about, you know, how do we get more fact-based and evidence-based research to be guiding public policy in view of, I thought, the really stimulating discussion we had with Roger Martin at the beginning of the day. So there are already some issues there for us to be talking about and thinking about. And then just the second thought that I wanted to share with you was, you know, I think inherent in the question of, you know, do politicians care more about, do governments care more about politics than policy, sort of implicit in that is, well, you know, they probably do care too much about politics, those wretched politicians. You know, if only they cared more about policy and about doing the right thing. I spent the weekend in Yalta, in Ukraine, where there's an annual conference organized by a guy called Viktor Penchuk, who's one of the Ukrainian oligarchs. And he brings together lots of Eastern Europeans. So there were a bunch of Ukrainian cabinet ministers, a bunch of Moldovan cabinet ministers, a bunch of Kazakh cabinet ministers, a bunch of Turks. And for them, the way they are framing this issue is much more about, should we even have politics? You know, is politics really a good idea? Or is it better just to be authoritarian regimes? It's kind of working for the Chinese, who they all talk about. And maybe a system where we can just have our smart technocrats, okay, a little bit self-interested, but still guiding things. Maybe that's going to work better than what we're seeing happening in Europe and in the United States. So this is actually a very live discussion from the other end of things too. Okay, without further ado, our first speaker, of course, is Kim Campbell. We all know her, the former Prime Minister of Canada, first female Prime Minister of Canada, a very proud moment. And I think that Kim is busier now in her political afterlife than she was as a politician. I see her on stages around the world, and I'm really looking forward to her remarks, having sort of now seen this issue both from what it's like being the person with whom the buck stops in governance and someone now who has the privilege of being a little bit more on the sidelines offering advice.
Well, thank you, Chrystia. And I must say, the first time I met you, I was kind of thrilled to meet you too, but I'd already met Peter Mansbridge. But you know, journalists are very confident. We shouldn't, you know, we shouldn't play to this too much. No living with it. The question is, as Chrystia has already suggested it, do governments care more about politics than policy? In some ways, it's kind of a leading question. It's a sneaky question because it sounds like it's bad if you do. The obvious answer to begin with is that they better care about both, because politicians who don't care about politics are ex-politicians. Or somebody might argue the current president of the United States, who's a wonderful guy, but some people are saying you're missing the boat on the political side of things. But it's also more complex than simply the relationship between politicians and the political process. There's also a question of the electorate, because the barriers to good policy making are not simply a perversity among politicians about not wanting to listen to good advice or not wanting to do the right thing or not wanting to think great thoughts. There is a political context in which people make policy. And I would argue that it's getting more and more difficult for politicians to do what they think is right, to make policy that is wise for the long term. You know, it's easy to be smart, it's hard to be wise, and the most important tests for policies are ones that you may even be willing to go to the mat for. Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, GST tax reform. These were things that our government went for. We knew they were controversial. We had no allies for the GST. Guess what's still there? The GST. Why? It was good financial policy. But the real challenge is having an electorate, to having a constituency for good policy. The thing that Canada has going for it, which the United States does not, is still a very high level of public education. Canadians can be very difficult, and I laugh when people say that they are deferential to authority. I've yet to meet the one who is. If you have two Canadians, you have three opinions on everything. But they are a relatively literate bunch, and they are relatively amenable to well-framed arguments about certain changes. And the disagreements tend to be philosophical, experiential. And the wise politician will listen to those who disagree with their politics, because it's very often a reflection of something that you don't know, that you haven't experienced. So you need to open the box. Now, Chrystia talks about seeing me around the world, and one of the things that I do, I chair the International Advisory Board of a think tank that functions in Ukraine, the Foundation for Effective Governance. And one of the things that we do is we really function in many ways like a public service, that we do policy analysis. Our agenda is that there needs to be economic reform in the Ukraine. We don't really take a position on which forms of bills need to be passed, but we try to do for the elected people what public servants have always done for us in Canada as elected people. And one of the most important think tanks in our society is the public service. They're not the only think tank. And when I was Minister of Justice, one of the things that I tried to do was to broaden the range. When we were doing Rape Shield, and all the usual suspects would come and give us their views. And I remember forcing my officials. We went to Toronto. We talked to, you know, organizations of women of color. We talked to women in the sex trade to try and get a much wider view of what the reality was of this area of public policy, what the impact of certain laws would be. And it's very interesting, because by the time I left the Justice portfolio, I felt it actually had an impact on the culture of the department, the need to broaden and make more diverse the number of people and the kinds of people that we listen to. So, and when but you know, process is not very sexy. And I remember in '93 when I was running for the leadership, and I put out this big document, Doing Politics Differently. And it's had all sorts of really mind-boggling things in it. And then the press after said, but what are you really all about? So Go figure. But one of the things that I argued at that time was to try and close the gap between academia and government, to try and make sure that the resources of our scholarly community were more readily available. You know, I taught at the Kennedy School, and they always joke that the Kennedy School was kind of a revolving door. Every time the government changes, you know, the Republicans drive up from Washington, they get out of the limo, the Democrats get in, they go back down, and vice versa. But there is a system, there is a tradition, and what that means is that not only do policymakers get advantage of the insights of the people who go deep, and I want to make a distinction between the wiki approach, the crowdsourcing, the group, the intelligence of groups, very important, but also the very special dimension that comes from having the benefit of the wisdom of people who can go deep. But not only does the government get the advantage of a lot of really quite fine scholarship, but the scholars themselves get exposed to the reality of the political process. Because one of the worst things that you can get are people who coming in, and one thinks of, you know, the best and the brightest, and some of the big disasters of policy, particularly in the United States, like the Vietnam War, where really smart people who don't know their proverbial from a hole in the ground when it comes to reality are espousing, you know, it's like I live in France much of the time, and the French say, you know, well, it may be good in fact, you know, in practice, but doesn't work in theory. And you get a lot of people who think that way and lead politicians astray, advocate things that are really bad policy. So teaching the experts, teaching the scholars what the reality is of a political process is very important. I think I'm almost finished here. But I would just add two things. Structure can affect the nature of the exchange that leads to making policy. And I'll give you an example of policies that can have unintended consequences. In the United States, the Federal Communications Commission changed its regulation or abandoned a regulation which required the holders of broadcasting licenses to present balanced or alternative opinions on major issues. That had a dramatic impact in the nature of the American media. So that you have this huge polarization. We talked about this before as a problem on the internet. It's a problem on the public airwaves. People tune in to have their own prejudices confirmed. This is a disaster for making good public policy. What can think tanks do about it? I don't know, but it just goes to show you that sometimes a decision that really has nothing to do with the substance of tax policy or Social Security or anything like that can have a devastating effect on the quality of the output of the political system. And RAND, Jim Thompson at RAM recently sent me a paper. I don't know if RAND did the research, but that says that in the United States, there is actually a geographical polarity, that people are starting to move to places where people think like them. And we're seeing politicians who want to meet the opposite side in common ground are being punished. They can't get nominations, they're being defeated. And it isn't just in the primaries by their militants, it's also in elections. So this whole value of compromise, of realizing that other people feel strongly, that you've got to find some mutual ground, is really coming out of fashion and becoming politically impossible. Just finally to say that with respect to the discussion we had about filtering online information, maybe you can filter, maybe you can't, but it's totally futile if people do not know what knowledge is. You have a Republican primary process in the United States where the one guy who doesn't have a clue, doesn't have a chance to be nominated, is the one guy who says, I believe in evolution, I accept the science of climate change, and I'm worrying that my party is becoming anti-science. My son was going to this Bill Maher show in the States, and I said one time earlier on several years ago that I didn't think in Canada, this is when George W. Bush was the president, that I didn't think in Canada you could ever be elected prime minister if you said you thought God wanted you to be there and the jury was still out on evolution. That is the mainstream position, and it represents a foundation on which the making of public policy, good policy, is almost impossible. And if think tanks can find a way to improve that, I don't think it's a problem in Canada. I think in Canada, the think tanks can enrich the quality of discussion. We need to find better mechanisms to integrate them in the policy process. But there are some parts of the world in which ignorance is the biggest barrier to good public policy.
Okay, thank you very much, Prime Minister. It's dangerous for me to listen to you and it's always dangerous for me to be in Canada because I go home to New York filled with Canadian smugness and self-righteousness, which Americans find very attractive in expat Canadians. Next, we're going to hear from Mel Cappe. Kim referred to how important public service is in Canada and that is one of our national think tanks. I can't think of a more distinguished Canadian public servant than Mel. I can't think of what important job he hasn't done both in government and also as Canada's ambassador to the world. I, in fact, first met him at his dinner table in London, where the chief guest was the Queen. So that gives you some sense of the impact Mel has had on the world. And he now, like Kim, has experience of the other side of the divide, going over to the think tank world. It must be fun, by the way, guys, to be advising people, having been on the other end of it. He's a professor at the School of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Toronto. Please, Mel.
Thanks very much, Chrystia. I want to address 2 questions. I've got 7 points. My first point, that question on that sign, can think tanks make a difference? That is not a new question. It was first asked by Erwin Rommel in the Africa Corps, and as he approached Al Alamein, he said, "I think tanks make a difference." He was wrong. They didn't help. So the second point, Jim Balsillie at the very outset of this began with 2 words. He said, "Ideas matter." I wish that were true. I'd like to think that it's true. As Kim just pointed out, it is sometimes true. And in the United States and sometimes in Canada, ideology is far more important than ideas. And I think that you could call it perspectives, you could call it approaches. At the end of the day, evidence, contrary to what Roger Martin said, evidence should guide us in policy development. Number 3, do governments care more about politics than policy? I hope so. I think it's a good thing. I agree that it is not obvious that that is a bad thing at all. I am a small d Democrat. I like the idea that our elected officials care about politics. Anybody that doesn't want to play politics can look to Libya as an alternative. There are ways of solving problems that are not political. I don't like them. I like political solutions to problems. Number 4, the nature of the issues we're addressing is increasingly problematic, complex, international, technological, interdependent, scientific, economic, and all of those words are profound, and I would give you a long discourse on each, but I'll just leave them with you. And I will say that each of them is changing more rapidly now than ever before. In the good old days, you had really tough problems, but they were there for a while and you could address them. And now our problems are changing more rapidly, and that in itself is a problem. Where do ideas come from? I had a long talk here. I would have talked about the public service. Kim's done it better than I. I will just say that political parties are not the source any longer of big ideas or great ideas. I think the research branches of political parties are in decline, and that's a problem for us. Think tanks have a place, an increasing role there. Number 5, can you create a market that values ideas? Back to Jim Balsillie's ideas matter. There is a supply, and I agree with Kim that the supply is great, that the public service used to have a privileged position in the supply of advice and the supply of analysis. It no longer has that privileged position. It is a much more open market in providing ideas. But I would argue that the demand for analysis is in decline. And it's the demand that we should be worrying about. It's where ministers return to evidence-based policy, where they ask questions before they come up with answers. It's a simple point, but we tend not to do it as much. There's a wonderful New Yorker cartoon which shows a gentleman behind his desk handing his underling a sheaf of papers, and he says, "Here are my policy assumptions. See what evidence you can find to prove it." Policy-based evidence is not what we're about. Think tanks are about evidence-based policy. Just on Roger Martin's point, I think the crucial issue here is I like his idea of thinking outside the box, logical leaps of faith, but you need a bullshit filter to be able to say, this is faith-based. I think Chrystia asked the right question. This is a faith-based belief rather than a great idea. Number 6, you need a taxonomy of think tanks. There are all kinds. Those that start with questions, those that start with answers, those that have perspectives, those that have values, those that have ideology. You don't treat them all the same. You need to be able to distinguish. At the end of the day, my final point, number 7, analysis will set you free. We can have intelligent debate with think tanks that base their positions on evidence, and where we have a vigorous, multi-voice cacophony of ideas, and we need more of them, and we need more think tanks like CG. Thanks.
Thank you, Mel. And I do think the CG organizers of this panel are sort of like great composers, and they've lined the notes up in perfect order because Mel has set up our next speaker almost perfectly. I was speaking to Carlo in the break, and he was saying to me that one of the things he's most interested in is the taxonomy of think tanks and how think tanks are different from one another. So thanks for doing that, Mel. And we've also been hearing a lot about the particular nature of the American political discourse. Carlo's an expert on that too, because he has done his time in Washington. The other thing that I'm particularly pleased about in his background that I think will really add to our discussion is he's an expert in how this relationship between think tanks and policy works around the world. He's worked a lot in the Caribbean, and his initial field of expertise was the Middle East, which I'm sure comes in particularly handy at the moment. So Carlo, we're looking forward to hearing from you.
All right, thank you very much, Chrystia. Let me start out first by thanking Mel. I'll get you the $5 after the session for setting me up so nicely. Also, let me state what a pleasure it is to be back here in Waterloo at CG. Over the years, I've been down a few times, and it's great to see the growth of the institution, the building next door. And it's also nice to be here talking about something other than Haiti for a change. So I really appreciate the organizers giving me a chance to talk about a different subject. And with that, I get the Balsillie rule. If you mention CG, you get another minute to your...
Well, your birthday reference doesn't count, so, but the clock is ticking now.
The question that's before us, do governments care more about politics or policy is a really interesting one. And it gets, in a way, to a need to take a look at the subject of discussion a bit more profoundly and a bit more nuanced, I think, than we have up until this point. The discussion has been very productive, focusing as it has on the large, endowed think tanks that are closer to academia, evidence-based research, large studies, pause, reflection. But there are a range of think tanks, as was mentioned, a taxonomy, and the different types of think tanks play different roles with governments, with policymakers, and with end users of products of think tanks, depending, obviously it seems, but worth mentioning, on the type of organization that's involved. The question's also interesting because it asks if governments value politics more than policy. In the Canadian context, of course, governments, we refer to the bureaucracy as well as what in the States would be referred to as the administration. And one of the things I found over the years of working in think tanks are the two different approaches, two different arguments in trying to get our research and make it relevant both to the bureaucracy but also to the political masters. It seems that there are almost two different worlds at times, and you're trying to take the same sort of policy recommendations, the same sort of research, and make it relevant. One point. The second point, on the taxonomy, we spend a lot of time talking about think tanks and the role that they play in creating ideas, in research and knowledge, either that directly contain policy recommendations or that are used to draw policy recommendations. But there are two other key roles. Communication. We talked a little bit about communication with social media, but communication by think tanks, and there's a whole taxonomy of groups that specialize in being reservoirs of information, talking heads on TV, informing or shaping discourse. In terms of implementing change and moving ideas, this role and the specialization in this role is crucial. But more than that, in terms of shaping public perception of what's acceptable for politicians as opposed to bureaucracies, this role is even more fundamental and more important. So there is not really that much of a dichotomy between politics and policy at that point. And think tanks that are able to bridge both, I think, tend to be a bit more effective or a bit more useful. Communication. It's not just shaping the views of the general public and policymakers, but it's also shaping the view of the base of the political parties. A great example of this is a case of the rise of conservative think tanks in the US in the 1950s and 60s. What you had, American Enterprise Institute, CSIS, Hoover, et cetera, that had been around or had been strengthened or changed during this time, was the ability not just to change public perception and not just to change thinking amongst policymakers, but also to change thinking amongst the base. By communicating with the base of the Republican Party, changing the thinking and the discourse within the base about public policy, informing the base about what was possible. If we get a new president, we're not going to be able to disband these agencies. We're not going to be able to rip up and rewrite the Constitution. They're realities. This shaping of the conservative movement turned the Republicans from being the public appearance of what Lawrence Trilling called, I think, irrational or no, irritable mental gestures as the sole mental or the sole ideal base of the Republican Party into a party of ideas. Ideas that were reflected and understood by the base and were supported by the base and then allowed the politicians to move in advance of that. So a key role that think tanks play. The third one, and I'll end on this, is implementation. In terms of policy, politicians are interested in policy formation and ideas, but they're also interested in implementation. Two examples of how this works and how it's important. In the Canadian case, our organization, the Canadian Foundation for the Americas, was an inside the government think tank, what's known as a GOINGO, a government non-governmental organization, a Canadian term that's now made its way around the globe. Not thanks to us, but thanks to the plethora of GOINGOs that we've produced in the country. But the point is, an important objective for Canadian foreign policy in the 1990s in the Americas was an increase in the role of civil society organizations in inter-American governance. This could be advanced by foreign affairs and other actors of the government arguing at forums such as the Organization of American States. But it was more effectively advanced by having a civil society organization make the case among civil society organizations, producing research and arguing within the sector to advance the policy ends of the government. An even more striking case, though, was in Haiti, and my time with the US government in Haiti. This was during Aristide's second turn in Haiti. There were, in essence, 3 US policies towards Haiti. The Democrats in Congress were in support of Aristide. The Republicans in the administration wanted him on the next plane out of the country, preferably a plane headed to the bottom of the ocean. The State Department was stuck in the middle, trying to balance between both objectives. This made them more suspect in the mind of the administration and less reliable. The result was that the administration chose to use a think tank, the International Republican Institute, to in fact implement a policy in Haiti that better advanced its objectives than what the government agencies could do at the time. It's interesting because this points out some of the key factors of think tanks and what makes them different and what makes them useful for politicians and politics. The skill set that a range of think tanks have is different from academic institutions. You have practitioners, former officials of state, the Pentagon, USAID, that are capable of implementing policies and doing things that other agents can't do. And in terms of politics, they play a role, especially as we saw in the case of Haiti, that no other organizations can do, and one that I think politicians find useful from time to time. It's no real secret how it's done. In the private sector, it's equivalent to your GR work, your government relations work, looking for people that are credible, and known within the communities you're trying to influence. And that's the most effective means to moving policies and ideas.
Okay, thank you very much, Carlo. Are we going to clap for Carlo too? Now we're going to hear from Lawrence MacDonald. He is currently the Vice President for the Center for Global Development. I consider him, though, to be still a recovering journalist. I think that once you have been a journalist for many years, as Lawrence has been, you can never quite get away from that taint. He tried to launder himself through the World Bank, where he was really responsible for some very innovative outreach and, sort of pushing the World Bank into this space that I see a lot of those institutions trying to occupy with varying degrees of effectiveness of really communicating with the world. So, Lawrence, please.
Chrystia, thank you very much. Happy birthday, CG. One of the small, very small silver linings of the collapse of the old media model is that the think tanks have been able to step into the breach, and so I get to continue to play journalist. So I would much prefer that the media was not in such disarray, but given that it's in disarray, I'm glad that I get to continue to wear my journalist hat occasionally. I want to start with a story. Around the time that I joined the Center for Global Development in 2003, Michael Kramer at Harvard was proposing an idea that to address the shortage of various kinds of global public goods, things that would be good for everybody but nobody had the incentive to fund, it would be possible to put money at the end of the process to make an advance market commitment so that when and if that thing was provided, then that money could be earned. The alternative model, of course, being you put the money in at the top with an R&D kind of process, and you hope that the things you want come out at the end. And he thought that the money coming at the top was all very well and good, but we weren't completing the cycle. And one of the most obvious areas for this was in vaccine development, where there are quite a number of diseases, as you know, in the developing world, for which vaccines are potentially hugely cost-effective prevention measures, but we don't have those vaccines because the pharmaceutical companies fear that if they developed them, they wouldn't be able to sell them. This idea was widely kicked around in academia, but it was not anywhere close to being implemented. And I had a colleague at the Center for Global Development, Ruth Levine, who thought, can we move this idea forward? And she convened a working group that included academics like Kramer, but it also included people who knew the pharmaceutical industry well, knew how big a prize would be needed. They decided most blockbuster drugs that had come to the United States had a market of about $3 billion. How could you credibly commit to buy something in the future that doesn't exist? How could you mimic the market? And they produced a report that was then pushed out. I helped to push it out in a variety of ways, and eventually we had, the UK was very interested in this idea. Under Gordon Brown, they brought it to the G8. The G8 assigned the project to Italy, that then recruited the World Bank to make it happen. Long story short, around 2008, before the financial crisis, we got an advance market commitment, and earlier this year we started delivering, the world started delivering pneumococcal vaccine, which pneumococcal disease, as you may know, causes meningitis and respiratory disease and kills about 3 million children a year in the developing world. There had been a pneumococcal vaccine in the rich world, but it wouldn't work in tropical countries. And the advanced market commitment accelerated the development of that vaccine. Now, why have I used 3 minutes of my 5 to tell you that story? Because timing matters. Ideas matter a lot, but it matters if you can have a well thought through plan that you can put before policymakers. I think policymakers would often like to do the right thing, but they're incredibly constrained by politics. And so it's part of the job of think tanks, especially small ones like mine, to prepare the ideas well, think it through in a way that the busy policymaker is not going to have time to do, and then be seeking the opportunities and the allies to push this forward. There are other approaches. Carlo has mentioned some of them. I really agree with what you, Carlo, and I think others have referenced to in terms of the role of the right-wing think tanks in the United States. They've adopted a much different kind of strategy, which is to shape public opinion. I think that they have legitimized ideas, especially libertarian ideas, that were formerly the provenance of the radical fringe. And so we had at the Republican debate recently a question about a hypothetical young person who, is dying. I can't remember what the question was, you know, would you save him or not? There are people in the audience saying, no, 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 let him die. You know, if he doesn't have insurance, that's his problem. That kind of thinking has been legitimated by these right-wing tanks. The other thing that the right-wing tanks did was to shift the entire political debate to the right by taking what are essentially centrist organizations like Brookings and branding them as liberal. My organization has been very fortunate so far. Nobody has called us liberal. You know, we've tried very, very hard to be nonpartisan, but there has been a concerted effort on the right to call the center liberal and thereby move the whole conversation over. I don't think in the United States that the left has done nearly as good a job. We have a Center for American Progress, CAP, that I think is a great institution trying to do this, but the progressive community has, partly by its nature being interested in true discourse and debate, has not been that willing to invest in that kind of approach. One possibility, and this is my final remark, for small institutions is to make alliances with large NGOs. In our case in the United States, we work closely with an organization called ONE that claims to have a mailing list of about 3 million people dedicated to poverty reduction. So we have active policy dialogues with them and hope in that way to shift the base. But you know, politics matters, and I think it's the job of the think tanks to figure out how to make a difference within that reality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lawrence. We should clap for really provocative remarks, and I think that get to the center of the heart of the issue. You've proven my suspicion that you still are a journalist by telling a story at the beginning, so that's great. And I do really thank you for referring to what I think is probably the most chilling moment in the race to 2012 so far. That, you know, do you let an uninsured person die because they were too dumb or too poor to have health insurance? It says a lot about where the discourse is right now, and I thank you for connecting that with what's happening in think tanks. I hope we'll have time to go back to that. Okay, now our final speaker, we have the chance to bring him into the discussion. We've heard his great question from the floor already. This is Enrique Mendizabal. He described himself as an independent researcher, which I really liked, suggesting that most of the rest of us are dependent. He's the editor of onthinktanks.org, and some areas of his expertise are Latin America and East and Southeast Asia. He's been doing some work on. So please, Enrique. Is your mic working? This is my punishment for not having kept you guys to your 5 minutes.
Just in case. Okay. Thank you very much. Yes, independent, basically because I'm trying to do all my as much as possible of my research and advice on my free time. I started working on think tanks while within a think tank, and it's quite difficult to come up with fairly critical analysis of organizations when you're within, which is interesting. So ironically, I had to leave to do some research. I wanna keep to my time, so I'll talk to about, I think, four key ideas. The first one is answer the question. I do think, and I'm gonna talk mostly about developing countries, which is the context in which I do most of my work. The first one is that I think that policy ideas rate much, much more than we tend to give them credit for. The problem is that decisions are not always and cannot always and probably shouldn't always be based on evidence alone. And so in many cases, in cases in which we are involved a lot of the time, evidence is considered, used, mixed up with something else, often dismissed, and a decision is made. But I would argue that it still played a role and had some influence in the final outcome. And it was mentioned before, I mean, this morning, governments are not ruling over robots or machines. They're ruling over individuals who have ideologies, who have perspectives, who have values. And therefore, policymakers, whoever they are, need to take these into consideration. I always try to tell a story on my second point, which is an event a few years ago. I was there, and there was an Argentinian and an Indian researcher talking about policymaking, and the Argentinian kept talking about politicians. The politicians do this, the politicians do that. And at some point, the Indian said, "Oh, I know what you mean. You mean policymakers." And the Argentinian said, "It's the same, it's the same." And it's because in Spanish we have only one word, política, for both, and we then add políticas públicas. So I always find it difficult to disassociate both, although I know there are some differences between elected politicians and civil servants. But I think this is a false dichotomy. So we talk about politics and policies, but in fact, it is very difficult to separate the technical bit of things from the ideological bit of things. And in international development, I have the impression that international development think tanks who sort of fall under the radar of politics, of mainstream politics in their countries, are more able, and I'm part of that, it's more likely for us, it's easier for us to present ourselves as independent, non-ideological, non-partisan, because there is not much of a debate on the issues that we address. But then this language is translated into many developing countries where donors do play an important role. And so the debate that does exist in developed countries is eliminated or is completely absent in some developing countries. So I think we should not try to separate it. Rather, we should try to reach a much more productive balance between both. Lawrence talked about timing, and I think that timing matters to bring these two things together. And as we talked earlier in the morning, it is not something you can manage. You can't plan ahead, right? So I am going to organize a study and a series of papers, and then they will be published at the right time, and I will have the right people in the room. What we need to have is to make it simple, and just two more points, the combination of the right institutions and the right people. And then they'll figure out how to talk to each other, when to talk to each other, how to translate technical ideas into practical ideas, ideology into technical terms. So one thing that we need to pay attention is to understand whether policies matter or expertise or evidence matters, is to look at the quality of the institutions, and not just think tanks, but also political parties. Are they able to aggregate these different ideas and put them into arguments that the general public can understand? Is the media capable of doing the same? Are academics and academia as an institution, is it strong enough? And I think that is how you start to reach the people. Not the think tank directly, but through a much more complex web of relationship. And the final point is the people. We need people in this system that are able to bring ideology and technocracy, if you want, technical inputs and ideological ideas together. And not just in think tanks, but also in the public. We talked about the need to have an informed and engaged public if we want a democratic debate. It's not just about elections, it's not just about competent policymakers, but it's about a public that participates, and this was mentioned in Canada. And also it's about understanding the life histories of individuals. So we were talking earlier today again about the role that evidence is playing in public policy. In international development, this is interesting. Many of the people who are now in the UK government, in the Department for International Development, at top positions, have a medical background. And so they've brought ideas from the medical field, and they're talking about randomized controlled trials, impact evaluations, etc. So we need to understand where people come from. And this is not just from the think tank side of things, but also from the policy-making side. So where do the policymakers are coming from will help us to understand why they might be paying more attention to what we're calling here policy ideas than they might be paying to political ideas. So just a few points.
Okay, thank you very much, Enrique. I love your linguistic point. Thanks to the whole panel for being pretty disciplined in the timing of your remarks. I say pretty disciplined. You weren't perfect, but you were pretty good. I think we have time for maybe 10 minutes of conversation amongst ourselves, and then we'll throw it open to questions from the floor. And so I would just like to ask, as a starting question, what I'm struck by, a thread running through everyone's remarks is, that the question we were set was, do governments care more about politics than policy. But what everyone has been talking about is that the politics really matters a lot, and that maybe the role of think tanks, as we've heard the right has done so successfully in the United States, is to influence the politics and to influence the public. And I'd just like to throw that out maybe for Kim to start. You know, should think tanks be doing that, and how can they do it?
Well, I think, I'm just repeating myself to say that I think creating a constituency for good policy is very, very important. And sometimes good policy is counterintuitive. Sometimes it requires people to be able to pay attention. But I think, again, when I say that there are policies that may have unintended consequences, I think the policies that undermine the quality of public education in the long run make this more difficult. But I think the extent to which think tanks can communicate and can broaden the scope of people who have the advantage of what they are able to conclude or discover, or in terms of debate, the more helpful they can be in that particular process.
Yeah, I want to disagree with some of the things that were said earlier in the day. I think that the role of think tanks is actually to inform the debate, but I'm not convinced that it should always be through the public, with all due respect. I think that the role of journalism is important in interpreting, and therefore I think that the role of think tanks should be to nourish the debate through intermediaries. And I would focus on the elites. And unabashedly, unashamedly, when I was in the UK, and I worried about how to position Canada in UK public debate, I basically gave up on the public. All I was caring about was the elite. When I was the president of the Institute for Research on Public Policy here in Canada, at the IRPP, I only cared about the elites. It was scholars, academics, and decision makers. I wanted to plug in, to brancher, as they say, to plug in the research to the decision makers. And I only cared about the elites. Now, I needed to interpret that and to have credibility based on the public's demands. So someone made the point earlier that the only way to get politicians to care about what a think tank is saying is if they know their constituents have read it in the newspaper the day before. So of course, it isn't a binary choice. But I think focusing on the elites is crucial.
Yeah, I want to just follow up with you on that, Mel. We've heard, I think, really interestingly about how some of the think tanks on the right in the U.S. have pursued an opposite strategy and had a very powerful role in shaping the debate by actually changing what at least part of the public thinks. Hasn't that been more effective than an elite-focused strategy?
Well, you see, now I'm going to side with Roger Martin. Don't give me evidence. I don't care about the evidence. I think that you're right. You've got the evidence in that example, and they've been extraordinarily successful in changing the debate. I think there are many ways to change the debate, and frankly, some think tanks are just very good at dealing with the public, and you need to have that kind of informing of the public debate through the public. But I really think there's also a place for an elite cadre of think tanks that can plug into the decision makers directly, relying on their colleagues in other institutions who will play convening roles. Back to Carlo's taxonomy, I mean, some will do very well dealing with the media, others will do very well dealing with scholarship, others will deal well with the elites.
I want to let Kim jump back in and then...
Well, I don't agree entirely because, I mean, a lot of major think tanks and research institutes, I mean, part of how they get their support is the sense among the public that they're viable. I sat on the board of the Salk Institute, which is, you know, a genius in terms of translating very sophisticated scientific research into the insights that the public can relate to and see how important it is. But I'll give you an example. I was at the IMF, I guess, earlier this year for some meetings, and one of the research papers which the IMF had done was a very interesting research paper which indicated a very interesting correlation between inequality and slow economic growth.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, this is, to me, is a blockbuster, you know, and don't hide this, you know, particular light under a bushel. This is something that people can understand. Now, scholars may want to go and they want to look at the statistics and they want to look at the analysis, and you better make sure that it's, you know, reasonably sound research before you publish it. But it's an idea that's really essential for the public debate, because, you know, it's like people who are still arguing for, you know, tax cuts for the rich to create jobs. You know, you had an 8-year laboratory experiment trying that out, and you had the most sluggish growth in the American post-war period. So, you know, who is taking these things? And I think think tanks, because they're independent and because they have the semblance of kind of scholarly underpinning, can take these ideas and translate them into in ways that the public can understand. And then, you know, as Mel says, that, or whoever said that, you know, then the constituents read them and the politicians take them you know, take it into account.
Carlo?
Thanks. It's an interesting question. I think that what the discussion that we've had underlies is, again, getting back to this taxonomy of think tanks. A better way to think of the sector is to think of it like a market. Not Wall Street, but like your fish market or an active market with all different sorts of vendors and actors in the market yelling and screaming and selling, trying to get products out, trying to convince customers. This is the think tank world that I see a lot of, places where elbows are up, ideas are debated fiercely. It's a very active and dynamic sector with tons of different products, tons of different ways to move messages, tons of different ways to create. And within this taxonomy, you actually have think tanks, public policy research centers that are explicit political actors. Perhaps the best example here is Mexico. In the Mexican case, the state budget contains funding for each party to have its own think tank. So you have think tanks, things that we would recognize purely as think tanks, whose role is overtly and designed to be political. But I don't see the issue here between the role with politics and think tanks as political actors. To some degree, if you're going to try and move policy, if you're going to try and move public opinion, you are a political actor, and to some degree, all think tanks are. The question, though, is the degree to which the institution is itself overtly a political actor. So,
does that mean that all think tanks are partisan, ultimately?
Political actors.
Yes.
That's an important distinction. I agree with Carlo.
You can be a nonpartisan political actor even in a highly polarized political environment?
Your politics can change, too. You could support a position that favors the NDP one day and, well, not the Conservatives the next, but maybe the Liberals the next day, or Republican one day, or Democrat the next.
Because parties change, so depending, you know.
Yeah, Ronald Reagan is now the prototypical Democrat in the United States. So the policies have really moved in that direction, where you see Democrats using things that would have been allied with the Republicans decades ago.
But look, the advocacy for a guaranteed annual income in Canada is being led by Senator Hugh Segal, who is a conservative. If it's a good, justified policy initiative, it's worth defending and pushing.
The Liberals were the party of free trade in our history until 1988.
I'd like to see all you guys in a Republican primary. That's all I can say. Enrique just put up his hand, so I'll let him go, and then you, Lawrence, if that's okay.
Thank you.
I think you have to share his mic now.
Yeah. I was going to follow from the point about the marketplace, and I think, again, I'm going to bring it back to a slightly different context, where there isn't that bit of a marketplace of ideas, where there aren't that many organizations, and where the other institutions who might be communicating to the rest of the public do not exist. And so their think tanks end up having to play multiple roles. I can have a list of 8 roles they can think of, but they have to communicate not just to policymakers, not just to the educated elites, but also to the general public, also to a media that isn't well informed. So it stretches them significantly. But I think this is an important point about the idea of marketplace, because it depends on how we understand the politics of the place in which we are working. So if we think of it of a pluralist context, where there are many actors involved, then think tanks do play a bit of a role in a sort of marketplace of ideas. They're selling ideas in a way. In a statist context, where the state has an important role, then a think tank plays a completely different role. And if we go to Vietnam or to China, and I think sometimes in the international development context, the state in a way is selecting a few winners of this sort of idea game and asking for advice. In elite context, where the elites are making the decisions, again, they will play a different role. So it depends on the context in which these organizations are, that we can see whether they can influence the politics or they can influence just the policies of their society.
Mel, I want to come back to your idea of think tanks working primarily to influence elites. That's certainly what we do, so I'm not going to disagree with that. But I think it's important also to note that when you talk about relying on intermediaries, that we're facing an extremely fluid landscape. Most of the intermediaries that you would have been able to talk to 5 years ago, not only are the individuals no longer there, but the organizations they worked for are gone. And at the same time, the reason they're disappearing is because you have this, the costs of becoming a broadcaster have fallen to nearly zero. So for me as a practitioner, it makes sense to do as I do and run a weekly podcast, because I can't be sure that I'm going to be able to get the attention of people on NPR because there are fewer of them. They're asked to do more and more all the time. And at the same time, I have this other alternative. So I think it's important to keep in mind that an elite-oriented strategy that relies on intermediaries is going to look very different in even a year or two than the way it does now, and very different from the way it looked just a few years ago. The other thing I would mention in terms of timing, 2 dimensions on that. One is when I told that story about the advanced market commitment, I think very often in think tanks, and it's true in my own, you have scholars who think, well, we're going to do the research, we're going to publish the report, we'll produce a brief, we'll give some interviews, and we're done. And I think it's very important that we encourage them to think of this as a long horizon activity. In the case of advanced market commitments, it took us 4 or 5 years. We still had some good luck on the timing, where the release of the report might be one of several peaks, but it's not the final thing. And again, I think this is something that the right has done very well in terms of something like privatization of Social Security. This is still a non-starter with the public. Doesn't mean that they have stopped thinking about it, talking about it. They'll roll it out, they'll wait a while, they'll roll it back. We have some ideas about improving trade conditions for developing countries. That happens to be a non-starter, but we're trying to copy the Heritage Institute to roll this out, roll it back, wait a while, look for another opening, and to not give up on things that you think are good ideas.
Just as a quick blitz question, so what's the best think tank? You talk about using the Heritage Institute as a role model. Is there one that you think has been doing, just tactically has been so great?
I'm so glad you asked. Is Jim McGann here?
Yeah, no, he isn't, but he should be.
Then I can speak frankly without, I've told Jim what I think of his think tank index. I think it's not very well done. I think everybody here has received the emails badgering you to respond. So far as I can tell, my efforts and those of my colleagues to encourage him to include some empirical measures of influence, things such as academic citation, web traffic, search rank, order, number of media mentions relative to staffing and budget, a whole variety of indicators that he might seek to gather. He's not gathered them. So my personal attitude is I'm no longer responding to those surveys, and I hope that you'll join me in boycotting the Jim McGann Think Tanks Index. I think the proper answer to your question of what is the best think tank is very contextual. It's certainly country by country, and it has to do with issue by issue, and the notion that he can find by asking people the best think tank in the world. I think those of us who are in the think tank business, of all businesses, ought to be speaking up against that kind of nonsense. And I should say my tank has done quite well in his rankings.
Well, I just wanted to say that when the IRPP was ranked in the top 5, I was a big fan. But when it became a popularity contest, which is what it is, like, have you heard about these people, then I tend to agree with Lawrence.
Yeah, deciding on which think tank is best or most effective, it's sort of like a Rubik's Cube. You've got all these different sides and dimensions. Are you talking about influencing policy? Are you talking about coming up with new ideas? Are you talking about preventing, advancing legislation? So the answer is more than just contextual. I mean, it'll change person to person every 5 minutes. So coming out with that sort of judgment, and yeah, the James McCann thing is an attempt, but it really should have been replaced by something a bit better, given the amount of time that it's been out and given the importance. A quick note on the think tanks and the sector as a market. One of the greatest changes to the sector has been the advent of technology and the lowering of cost of entry for new participants. new media, the ability to have people work from
You mean new
distinctive-
entrants into the think tank
into
world?
the think tank world. Yeah.
Anybody can have their own think tank now?
You're getting to that point, and it's really changed it from an elite process where you would work through elites to get messaging out and to influence policy to a more open and atomized process. And you see this, I think, especially in the States. At one time, the only way to get opinions out to the Republican mass was think tanks sent pre-taped radio interviews to conservative stations. And they had a monopoly almost on communicating with the base. That's gone. And you see the change, I think, in the conservative movement as that elite control has kind of disappeared.
Okay, I'm going to have a couple more comments because I see some of our panelists really want to say stuff, but get your questions ready and then we're going to go to questions from the floor. So Mel.
Just on Carlo's last point, I am struck that you can't tell the players without a program. There are all these different think tanks out there. Everyone calls themselves a think tank. And one of the challenges for the media, Chrystia, is to interpret the quality of what think tanks publish. Because so many journalists will merely say, you know, Buggins, who works at such and such think tank, has said, and that has equal credence with the scholars at CG. And I don't think that should be the case.
And the need to find someone on both sides, too.
And they need, absolutely right. You need to find a climate change denier if you're going to be credible.
But then how more important is it for think tanks to be extra transparent in where their funding comes from, who they are talking to? So I think some of the problems we associate with the public sector or the government not being transparent enough can then be associated to think tanks who might be influential and quite influential of elites, but because they're not doing it in the open, they might end up suffering in the long run because of this. I mean, we mistrust anything we don't understand. So if what think tanks do is unclear, we'll just put them in the same package with everybody else.
Okay, since Mel addressed me directly on the point of journalists, I'll have a little bit even more professional breastfeeding. And Lawrence has referred to the shrinking of media. It's really true, and something that I see happening in think tanks and NGOs in response is more processed food, more intellectual processed food is being created for journalists. You know, so lots.
We like to think it's hot cuisine.
Yeah.
But they're fully cooked meals in any event.
Depends on who's doing the cooking, right? But you know, I probably know more journalists now who are working in think tanks or NGOs than who are working as journalists. And a lot of them are doing exactly the same thing they used to do when they were working officially as journalists. And, you know, smart think tanks and NGOs have figured out if you can present a totally pre-packaged story, do the reporting, find the vivid personal anecdotes, put the journalist directly in touch with the person who represents the terrible cause that you are agitating on behalf of, sometimes supply the video footage, then you are much more likely to have your story written about because you've done all the work. And, you know, I was about to say it's not because journalists are lazy, but then I thought everybody would laugh. So it's not only because journalists are lazy, it's also because there are fewer of us and under more pressure to produce stories quickly. So I do think that's another thing that's going on. Anyway, questions, please.
Yeah, thanks very much. My name is Phil Rourke. I'm from the Center for Trade Policy Law at Carleton in Ottawa U.
Could you
Closer? Okay. Question first to Madame Prime Minister. I'm really interested in your insights about last time we had a majority conservative government and how they apply to what we'll see in the next 4 or 8 years. And I really captured, you captured it well. Your government looked at all the options and said, we're going to go bold. And they went bold first with the free trade agreement. They fought an election over that. And then they went bold again with the GST and other kinds of policies. Now, Stephen Harper's many things, but one thing that he's very good at is he's a very shrewd political historian. And I would think that he's looking at that experience and thinking, okay, it lasted 8 or 9 years. How do I get to the second and third mandate? Meanwhile, on the other side of the House, you have a similar situation as in '84. You have opposition parties that have been decimated. You now have parties that are going through leadership discussions. The major parties, the minor parties are trying to find some relevance, and then we have provincial elections all across the country. So this should be fertile ground for policy entrepreneurs. So what have we learned, where are we going, and how do we connect with what might happen in the next few years? Because we've been in no man's land for 5 years of minority government. This is the first time that we're starting to get comfortable again with majority governments.
Well, I'm touched that you would think that I would be able to tell you what Stephen Harper is going to do with his majority. I'm not even sure Mrs. Harper knows what he's going to do with his majority. But let me just say something about the origin of the policy of the Mulroney government. One of the great think tanks in Canada in our history was, in fact, a royal commission called the MacDonald Royal Commission. And my former professor, Alan Cairns, was one of the leading researchers in the MacDonald Royal Commission, which was one of the most in-depth analyses of the Canadian economy and polity in the post-war period. And the MacDonald Royal Commission was chaired by Don MacDonald, a Liberal, but one of its recommendations was that Canada should negotiate a free trade agreement with the United States, should initiate negotiations. And Brian Mulroney had been elected when people had said to him when he ran in '84, what do you think about free trade with the U.S.? And he said, like, well, it's a terrible idea, and we'd get, rolled over by a bulldozer. But again, it was the credibility of the research of the MacDonald Royal Commission that I think made him say, hang on a bit, folks. Maybe we should be taking this seriously. And it became a big idea, and it turned out that the timing was great because after the end of the Cold War, we weren't nearly as strategically important to the United States. We might not have been able to negotiate the agreement. So what I'm saying is that big ideas come from a lot of different places. The goods and services tax, the federal sales tax was killing Canadian jobs. We're an export company. There were over 2,000 cases in the courts by companies challenging it. It was something that had to be solved, and we bit the bullet and solved it, and we paid a political price for it. The question is, are there equal kinds of issues out there that the current government is going to have to deal with? Where will the provocation come from to tell Stephen Harper, you may not like this idea, but, there's a really strong reason for you to deal with it. I don't know the answer to that. And I don't think it always happens. Pierre Trudeau, 12 years kind of boring history as Prime Minister. He wants to get out. The Tories don't count noses. He's got to be back again. He decides to repatriate the Constitution. Where did that come from? Well, if I'm going to stay for another 4 years, I'm going to really drive everybody crazy and do it. So every once in a while, there's just something that comes up that has to be done, and for whatever reason, somebody develops the political courage to do it. What Mr. Harper will do, I have no idea. But if you figure it out, please call me, Campbell at kimcampbell.net.
Kim, I would just like to follow up on this point of political courage and paying the political price, because I think that was one of the issues implicit in the question we were set. And you've talked about the GST. Well, you guys did certainly pay a political price. And, sometimes in the U.S. there's a debate now about should they have a GST, should they have a value-added tax. I think as a policy matter, it's pretty obvious that they should. But when I talk to Americans about it and I say, well, that's how Canada basically solved the budget deficit, and they say, yeah, but look at what happened to the Canadians who were the ones who implemented that. It doesn't look so great to us. How as a politician do you balance that? Well,
there's all they say, you may as well be hung for a sheep as for a goat, and if you're going to lose an election, you may well lose it for something that's a good idea. But talking about taking the politics seriously, let's look at the recent British Columbia referendum on the harmonized provincial sales tax, GST. This is an example where failure to pay attention to politics killed a very good policy. When the Premier went into election, said, no, we aren't going to do this, and then after the election said, well, actually we are. Now, when did he change his mind? He may have had, a road to Damascus experience, and honestly, like Pierre Trudeau walking in the snow, changed his mind, but the politics of it stank. And the people in British Columbia had the idea that he was trying to pull a fast one over. And the sad thing is that there has now been a referendum to kill the harmonized tax. It's going to be hugely complicated for the province, and in the long run will be bad for the economy. So when you don't pay attention to the politics, sometimes you lose the policy. If you're in the beginning or you're early enough in a majority mandate, you can implement the policy and you can try and ride it out. The only problem in British Columbia, it wasn't just a question of the government riding it out, it had to be the question of Bill the Teeth van der Zam looking for an issue to remove the stake that had been driven through his heart in a previous time and reemerge on the public scene. So there's always these things. And again, remember, Sheila Copps, you know, we're going to, you know, if we don't get rid of the GST, I'm going to resign. You know, it's, there's no guarantees, but at the end of the day, you really have to do what you think is right in the long run. And there are a whole lot of reasons why you can lose an election. And as I say, you may as well hang for a sheep as for a goat. If you're going to lose, you may as well be able to say, well, you know, at least I think we did what we should have done. Not, gosh, here we're losing the election and I wish we'd done those things because, you know, now our legacy is zilch.
Okay, bravo, I say. Louise Frechette.
Thank you. I have a question for the panel. I think we're all agreed that think tanks are in the business of influencing policy, and I think that's what distinguishes them from university-based research, for instance, at least theoretically. But in your mind, is there a line to be drawn between what is proper for a think tank and what is proper for advocacy group? How far should think tanks go into advocacy? When I mean advocacy, it evokes in my mind organized kind of sustained campaigns to promote a particular idea. Is this something that think tanks should do as a matter of course? What's the risk, what's the downside if they go down that route?
And do you have any particular panelists, any favorites you want to answer that question?
No, I think they're all very good.
Okay.
I could be a politician, too.
Yeah.
Even better, you were at the UN, Louise.
Yeah, even worse, probably. Okay, who wants to go first? Let's let Lawrence go first. He's been at the end of the line for a while.
The question's very close to my heart. It's something we struggle with a lot. Our founding chairman, who was, unlike Jim Basile, not as big, but also a dot-com millionaire, was very action-oriented, and he really wanted a tank that was going to engage in advocacy. And my founding president, Nancy Birdsall, said, no, we don't do advocacy. We do policy engagement. And I think that in the end, she has been right, that the credibility of our work is that it is based on solid research, and if you're going to engage with elites actively, which you need to do, you can't also be organizing the people out on the streets or doing the letter-writing campaigns. But there is a fuzzy line. I would say think tanks are more effective if they share information with the advocates, but don't try and get into the advocate space. That seems to be working for us.
Mel, I think you were
bouncing. Two points. The first, back to this taxonomy. I think it's perfectly legitimate for a think tank to be an advocate. But that's not the kind of think tank that I wanted to run. I liked being at IRPP because we were what we've all characterized as independent think tanks. By independent, I think we mean that the evidence speaks, that the rationale, the argumentation, the analysis is what is compelling, not that we have a point of view that we start with and we end up there as well. There's a wonderful story, well, two little anecdotes. The first is that when Roger Martin almost apologetically said, I even like the Fraser Institute because they measure things. Mark Mullins, he was the president of the Fraser Institute, used to have a signature block that said, markets are the solution to policy problems. And that was his tagline. Well, I think that's true for a lot of them, but I don't think it's true for all of them. Now, the Center for Policy Alternatives, they say, government is the solution to all policy problems. And again, the truth lies somewhere in between. The last example, though, is Hugh Siegel. When I asked Hugh Siegel, when I took over from him as president of IRPP, how would you know you've been effective? He said, well, I'll give you an example. In the 2005 December leaders debate for the 2006 election, Paul Martin cited an IRPP study to justify his healthcare policy. And Stephen Harper cited a different IRPP study to justify his healthcare policy. that's how you know you're effective. You've animated the debate, and you're not on one side or the other. And I thought that was a very good example.
Okay, Carlo wants to.
Very quickly, it's an interesting question, but one that begs the question of definitions, too. You know, the taxonomy of think tanks in places where you have a very variated market, you will have groups that function more as what could objectively perhaps be described as advocacy. And there's a certain need for them where there's a robust debate of ideas and many actors on both sides. Yet, I would argue that if you were to go to some of these groups that you would think of as advocacy organizations or advocating on a particular issue and ask them if they were advocating or why they were advocating, the response would be, well, no, we're simply fulfilling our mission to inform the public. We are participating in a debate. We are contesting information. So this idea of advocacy, I think really within the sector too, you'd find a great deal of disagreement over where informing or shaping opinion stops and starts and where advocacy begins.
Yeah, I just have one sort of follow-up question on that issue, maybe especially for Mel and for Lawrence. So, you know, you guys are very much positioning yourself as the fact-based, you know, we're in the middle kind of guys, and we're just going to come up with great ideas. Aren't you just going to get beaten up and pulverized by the muscular advocate markets are the solution think tanks, especially in this soundbite world that we now inhabit?
It's a danger. You know, I come back to the different roles of different kinds of institutions, and I think Carlo's onto something here. There's I argued earlier for a cacophony of voices. I think we need advocates to play that role. I actually wouldn't call them think tanks. They're advocates. But we also need people who can déblayer le terrain. They can cut through the underbrush and clarify the nature of the questions and provide evidence and analysis. And we need different people to play different roles. So if my effectiveness is in setting the agenda for the next 5 or 10 years, but having no effect in the next year or two, that may be just fine. Thank you very much.
I don't want to leave the impression that, you know, because you may have guessed I'm not very fond of the American right, that my institute only can push ideas when the Democrats are in power. We've had some of our biggest successes under Republican administrations, and I think it's important when we talk about policy engagement to recognize that, you know, you find your allies where you can find them. And that's a reason to not be identified as a strident advocacy organization. But I want you to say your question again, because I don't feel like I quite answered it.
Well, no, my question was just, you know, do you guys who are trying so hard to be fact-based and bipartisan, do you stand a chance in a world dominated by very strong partisan voices? And I would refer maybe to the debt ceiling debate to show, you know, how well that bipartisan thing really fared.
I do have a concern, and that was the reason for my preamble about my organization really is nonpartisan. I do have a concern that the balance of money in the United States very much favors conservative ideology, and I think that the recent Supreme Court ruling on campaign finance makes that worse. So I do think that that's skewed, and I think those of us who, you know, don't share those views, it's up to us to try and find and work with and lead agile institutions who can make a difference even on that uneven playing field. But I think for my society, the fact that the playing field is now very much tilted in favor of money that seems to have very short-term horizons is a cause for concern.
Enrique? And then we'll go to the question. Yeah,
I think the question also had to do with sustaining a campaign, or sustaining an initiative, sustaining a set of activities. And I do think that it's often having a perspective or having values and ideology to back it up, to support your evidence. It helps. So organizations will tend to sustain their work for much longer. They'll find more funds to help them continue doing research, analysis, communication, building networks, working with advocacy organizations for a much longer time. They have a clear argument and not just evidence. Evidence won't speak for itself. The argument will, and the argument will make appeals to values, to ideology, to political partisan interests, non-partisan interests, peer pressure. So it's not just the facts, it's the whole package. And the more of a whole package you have, the more convincing that whole package is, the more likely you're going to be able to sustain your campaign or your activities, the more likely you're going to get more funding in the future, etc. So And that's what I would say.
Okay, let's have a couple more questions. Please, was there a question in the back there? No? Okay, question up here.
Thank you very much. My name is John Siebert. I'm the Director of Project Plowshares. We do advocacy, we do research, we do a whole number of things. And it's kind of a mixed bag, so when you get to the taxonomy, it's an interesting question, what are we? But if you look at the Canadian tax code, there's some implications for the certain use of some of these words. I'm wondering if we could have a think tank who would look at charitable ends. Any response?
A think tank that would look at?
Charitable ends, the ability to raise funds from the public.
Okay, I'm going to take a couple of questions because we're running out of time, so we will log that one. Any more? And I have one from people who are listening to us on the web. Okay, so the web question it's from Karine LeBlanc in Ottawa, and she asks, if to have political influence you need to reach a political party's base, how do you do that? And especially, how do you do that if the focus of your think tank is on an issue, for example, development, that doesn't really have a domestic base? So I think those are two final questions, and I'll let everyone who chooses respond to them, ideally kind of succinctly, because we have about 5 minutes left. So who wants to kick it off? Enrique, yeah.
From here. So the second question, if you need a political base.
Yeah, how do you reach a political base, especially if your issue is one that doesn't really lend itself to a domestic political base?
Okay, it's easier the other way around, of course. But for instance, Lawrence mentioned the One campaign. So the One World Trust, they claim to have a political base in a sense. They've identified young and not so young people around the UK and other parts of the world, and mobilize them around international development. It's not just about the Live Aid concert, they would argue. So a think tank working in international development would have to work with them, would have to tap into those networks that actually reach into different parties and allow them to have to develop that political base, which is not very strong because it will come and go depending on the circumstances. But this is where the issue of being persistent and remaining on the scene for a very long time will pay off.
I think I'll pass. I don't have anything to say right now. If I think of something, I'll let you know.
Okay.
I've got something to say on both.
Go
but
for it.
Very quickly, on Karine LeBlanc's question on the, I mean, one way is to bypass the party base. That's somebody else's job. We did at IRPP a book on the Arctic and people, politics, and place. And what we did was brief the caucuses of 3 parties, brief the critics of the 2 opposition parties, and give them the analysis as ammunition that they could use within their own party base. And that's what they're good at. On the question of the research versus advocacy, I think that's a really profound question that the Revenue Agency is going to have to address that. It's a tough one. I tell my students at U of T now in the master's program that they're going to have more opportunity to affect policy by going to work at NGOs than they will in the public service. I regret to say that because I like Kim's opening comment, but there is a policy analysis capacity among NGOs now that is really quite profound and significant, and that's where a lot of good work is going to come from. And doing 10 to 20% advocacy is not going to be qualified for, not going to allow a lot of people to qualify for charitable status.
Can I just make a point? You know, a lot of people have policy positions that actually, if they examine them more closely, they might they might want to change. And I think of this in terms of international development. And we keep talking about the United States, but public opinion research shows that most Americans think that they spend way more on foreign aid than they do, and you know, there's a totally mixed up view of it. The BBC had a report recently about a reality TV show in Australia that took people who absolutely hated immigration, and it was a reality show where they actually traced the steps of migrants who come to Australia. And this woman, who was just great, she was so honest, she said, well, you know, I've actually had to change my views, and that makes me uncomfortable because I don't like to change my views. The fact of the matter is it's very difficult sometimes to be an advocate for opinions, to be an advocate for ideas, and you have to, you know, as Mel says, really keep working at it. But I think it's also important to understand that we all have predispositions, we all have preconceptions, and we all suffer from cognitive dissonance if we encounter things that don't appeal to us. And that's why the diversity and the exposure is so great, and why I think for the public service, one of the great things that the public service can be is to be kind of entrepreneurial for their political bosses about opinion and thinking, to reach out beyond the usual suspects, to reach out to groups that may have things to say, and keep the intellectual discussion alive, because we all suffer from groupthink, we all suffer from self-replication, and it's not a bad thing, it's human. You know, our lives are so complex and our brains are so complex, we couldn't function if we didn't function on the basis of the schemas, the hypotheses that we lay down from the time that we're born. So I think that it is important to have this sense of the importance of intellectual diversity, the conflict of values, but also to know what knowledge is, to understand what is an opinion and what is an established fact, what is a statistical probability. And that scares the wits out of me, that there are people out there for whom ignorance is a virtue, don't like them, you know, them book-reading people, you know. I agree with Michael Oakeshott. There is a limit to bookishness in politics, but it doesn't, you know, involve, you know, sticking your finger in your ear and saying, you know, dunno, and I know as well as the guy next door. So there needs to be a middle ground.
I can't resist Kim telling you a 30-second story riffing on your immigration point which talks a little bit about how the Canadian public opinion is formed. I still remember absolutely vividly when I was in grade 5 in Rio Terrace Elementary School in Edmonton, they had actors come in and all the kids were divided into groups. We were immigration agents. And there were 5 actors. We could only let 3 of them immigrate to Canada. And they each told us their stories of why they wanted to immigrate. And it created such a profoundly pro-immigration sentiment in our class that they had to stop after an hour because we all protested and we said we want to let everybody come into Canada. These are all very good people and we believe in opening our borders completely. So that was propaganda.
That's why grade 5s are not making immigration policy.
What a great story. It's a pretty Canadian experience, though. Carlo.
Those were actually 2 very technical questions, I think concise technical answers. In terms of a group in Canada that could look at the issue of nonprofits, Imagine Canada. They know the sector very well. They do this sort of work. What's focused attention, I think, within the sector and within academia, too, has been the change in the Lobbying Act and the need now to report on contacts with members of Parliament and political staffers. That's a step in the direction towards both transparency and to looking at when the institutions cross over a line. There's a line that's been drawn by the government under the Act. If you spend a certain amount of resources or time, well then, no more fudging it. You're clearly in the advocacy or lobbying camp. In terms of how to reach the base, you know, one time this was very simple. You had radio and you had newspapers. Those venues or those means of communication are still important for the members of the base that rely upon them intensively for information. But it's also new media and looking at examples that are successful. I mean, it's changing debates, it's changing terms, it's reaching out for new alliances. One of the most profound ways that this was done in Canada was the debate over Bill C-300, the private members' bill to ban mining or to require intensive reporting on mining activities. The groups that were in favor of it managed to touch into a very conservative element, a large element of the conservative base. by going after church groups in Canada and touching on issues of social importance that were important to these groups in conservative parts of the country. So I think if you begin to break down the issue and look for natural allies, as someone said, you find your allies where they may be. That's what we're seeing increasingly. It's an atomization that allows us openness on the one hand, but an atomization that's led to some more unpleasant things happening in the States on the other hand.
Okay, I'm going to have a final blitz round. I am Jim Balsillie. I am giving each one of you $10 million to do your think tank thing on one policy. What's the policy? It can't be something you're working on now. Enrique?
Well, obviously, I would use it on studying think tanks. So.
We have some terrific ideas on climate change and development. We're actively seeking funds. I know exactly where I'd spend
I'm not acting on Jim's behalf here.
I'd spend it on our work on the relationship between carbon emissions, adaptation, and the impact on poor people.
I think I would conduct a study on the most effective return that could be generated on $10 million. There's actually a realm of things that need to be done in terms of area studies and strengthening Canadian positions. So anything from our agenda in the Americas would be great use for the money.
The determining issue for the future of Canada, I think, is going to be Aboriginal issues.
Well, I already work on a lot of these issues: climate change, advancement of women, spread of democracy. But maybe one of the things that really worries me about climate change are the weak countries, the poor countries with weak governments. Oh, I know what I would do. The effect of organized crime on democratic development, one of the biggest threats, and that needs to be studied more.
See, I knew you'd come up with a new one. Okay, thank you very much, panel. They're going to kill us if we keep on talking, but I wanted to hear your final answers. Thank you very much. Really fabulous discussion. I really was grateful.
Here, here.